Welcome to 3D Printing, Professional Finishing for Beginners, presented by the Mount Royal University Library Maker Studio. In this video, you will learn how to clean up 3D prints and finish them with paint. For more project ideas, resources, and information, you can go to the Maker Studio website, which is found on the Mount Royal University Library website under Spaces.
In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that the Mount Royal University is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta.
This workshop will discuss the benefits of finishing a 3D print for a project, outline safety protocols used for finishing a 3D print, and demonstrate how to finish a 3D print, including where to get materials, what steps to take, and how to add finishing touches beyond paint. At the end of this workshop, participants should be able to understand the benefits that finishing a 3D print will add to their project, identify what safety precautions to use while finishing a 3D print, recall where materials for finishing a 3D print are available, and repeat the steps demonstrated in this workshop to professionally finish their own 3D prints. There are steps you can take when setting up your 3D model to be 3D printed, which can help reduce the amount of work you have to do to clean up your print afterwards. The Maker Studio has many videos and workshops available to help you learn those skills. Safety is always important, so make sure when you're finishing your print that you're wearing the correct equipment to make sure that you're safe. So there will be little pieces flying off your 3D prints. Be sure to be wearing glasses or goggles to protect your eyes. When you're using sharp tools, be sure to be wearing gloves. And when you're painting or priming, make sure you're wearing a mask and that you're in a well-ventilated area. There are many different kinds of tools you can use to clean up your 3D prints. My favorite are needle nose pliers, which you can see on the right, and cutting tools, which you can see on the left. The cutting tools are very handy because they have a flat side and they can lean up against the model without cutting it, so you can get a very close cut. Needle files are excellent tools for cleaning up hard to reach places on 3D prints. You can buy sets that come in a variety of sizes and shapes. If you are going to paint your 3D print and you have some gaps in between your layers, you can use spackle to fill it in. That works out really well. It's very easy to sand. If you are sanding your 3D print to take off any rough edges, you can use a high grit sandpaper to smooth off the rough edges. Don't use an electric sander, it'll melt the plastic. And don't sand it too deep because most 3D prints are hollow. If you are not going to paint your 3D model and you've sanded it, you might have some white marks, scratch marks left from the sandpaper. What you can do is get this non-toxic mineral oil to take away the marks. So you just use it by putting some on a piece of paper towel, rubbing it on the 3D print, and then using a clean piece of paper towel to rub it off again. And that should take care of all of the white marks. Now for this video, I have 3D printed a dice tower for my husband for demonstration purposes. So you can see it here. This is it totally finished after being painted. It's completely done. My husband had asked for a castle that looks old and kind of run down. So that's what I had in mind while I was painting it. So I'm going to take you through the process of how I got this to look this way, and you'll see a picture at the end of it and you'll be able to recognize all of the steps that we took to make it look the way it does here in this picture. I would just like to say at this point that these are the techniques that I use to paint my 3D prints. There are a lot of other techniques that you can use that other people do, but these are just the things that work for me. So hopefully you'll find that they work for you as well. Here you can see one of the parts being printed on the 3D printer. This specific model came in 5 parts. Now remember I said that there are steps you can take to make sure that your model doesn't require as much cleanup afterwards. So when I printed this specific print, I actually didn't do that. I wanted to make sure that you could see lots of little bits hanging off it and missing pieces that have broken off, and so I purposefully made it so it would have more work afterwards. You can see here in this piece that part of it has broken off, so what you can do in that case is you can save it and glue it on. So you can use any kind of crazy glue that's made for plastic, that's meant for plastic, on 3D prints. So what we're using here is Gorilla Glue Crazy Glue, and it works really well to hold the bits together if they break off. And you can see my husband here is gluing that piece back on. Now crazy glue is very, very adhesive, so be sure to not get any on your fingers, and if you do, to wash it off right away. And now you can see that you can't even tell that it was missing or broken. Here, my husband is using the cutting tools to take off part of the raft that I had used for printing this piece. And here he's using the needle nose pliers to take off the support material. And here he's using the needle file to smooth down the railings in the print. You can see that he's wearing a mask to protect himself from any little bits, and he has his safety glasses on and his gloves. He's using a 400 grit sandpaper now to smooth out any more overhangs. Here you can see the 5 pieces are ready to be painted. They're all nice and smoothed down. You can see on the spiral staircase there are some white marks from sanding, and if I wasn't going to paint these, I would use the non-toxic mineral oil to get rid of those white marks. So it's important now to let you know that I chose gray filament for my print because it's a castle and the base color of the stone is gray, so that's going to help with any kind of coverage with paint. But if you had a print that had multiple colors on it, like a figure, I would print it in a filament that's the lightest color, close to the lightest color. It's easier to cover a light filament with dark paint than it is to cover a dark filament with light paint. If it's possible, that's what I would do. Priming is a very important step. The primer helps the paint stick to the plastic. If you don't use it, it's possible that your paint can chip off later. You can buy filler primers and it smooths out the lines from your 3D print. You would do a coat and then you would sand it slightly and then you would do another coat and sand it again. I would always recommend using a primer that's meant for plastic and use a water-based primer, not oil-based, because you'll be using water-based paint later. The primer that you see here in this picture is for model painting. You can get it at different kinds of gaming stores. It's kind of expensive, but you only need a very light coat of it to have your paint stick to your model. So you can see here I am priming the 5 pieces. I'm in a well-ventilated area, and you can't see it, but I am wearing a mask. So it's important to just do light coats. Like I said earlier, the primer that I'm using only requires one very light coat. It doesn't have to be solid. If you are using a different color filament than the paints that you're going to use, like how this is a castle and it's gray, and I'm going to be painting gray paint on it. If you are using a different color, you might want to do a more solid coat of primer. There are three different stages of painting. One is base, the second is shade, and the third is dry brushing. And you can see here I have three examples of all of those stages. You don't have to buy the specific brand of paint. If you want to, you can get it again at gaming stores, but you can just use acrylic paint as well, which you can buy at like dollar stores or craft stores. So we have three different kinds of brushes here for the three stages of painting. The first one you'll see at the top here, and that is the base paint brushes. So we have two. One is a very small brush, and you use those to get the very small things to paint, obviously, and also to try to not overlap your paint. So areas that come together that are different colors, you can use this small brush to do that. And then the bigger brush is for doing a larger area. The next kind of brush is the shade brush, and this one is important to get the specific kind of brush. And again, you can get it at craft stores or art supply stores. The shade is very watery. It kind of has the consistency of food coloring, so this brush helps to draw it up into it. And the third kind of brush is for dry brushing. So I just actually get a cheap brush that looks like this one, and then I kind of smush it into like a flat surface, like a table, not while it has paint on it, obviously. And I keep doing that until it's flat, and that's what I use for dry brushing. And so here you can see we're starting with our base coat. So you wet your brush, and then you just take a piece of paper towel and you make sure to dry the brush going the direction of the bristles. So I'm using the bigger brush here, and I'm just filling in each of the spaces that I want to color with the paint that I choose. So I usually have some kind of palette, so I'll take a piece of paper and I'll just drip a little bit of acrylic paint onto the paper, so just a tiny bit, and then I'll start painting. So these sections that I'm painting are quite large, so I'm using the larger brush, and I'm trying to give the castle a little bit of depth and dimension, so I'm painting different colors, I'm using different colors of gray to do each of the blocks. Now I have the very small brush, and I'm using that to paint the smaller blocks in the castle. And if you accidentally paint over something that you didn't want to, you can always just touch it up using the same base color that you had used to cover it up. So here I'm again using the bigger brush to paint the gate brown. But I'm not going to paint very close to the edges where it's going to be gray. For that process, I'll use the smaller brush. So you can see here, there's some latches on the gate. So I painted as close as I could safely with the bigger brush, and now I'm using the smaller brush to paint right up against the latches. That way I don't have to worry about layering the paint. I don't have to worry about having thick layers of paint taking away some of the detail of the print. So I've washed the brush, and now I am going to paint the latches a metallic silver color. I've washed the brush again, the small brush, and I'm going to add a little black acrylic paint to paint the bolts on the latches. These small brushes are amazing. You can use them to do eyes on very small models. So here we have the base coat finished, and you can see 3 different pieces of the model done here. And it looks okay, right? It looks all right, but it's pretty flat. So we're going to use shading and dry brushing to give it a little more depth. Okay, so let's get started with the shade. So I'm using a shade from Citadel, and you can use that as well, or you can, I know other people, I haven't tried it, but other people have used just acrylic paint and then watered it down. So what I'm doing is I'm using the black shade to go over the latches. So what shade does is it's kind of like jet dry. It'll roll into the cracks and the crevices, and it'll roll away from any high points. So then it actually defines your prints, because now you can see the lines, you can see like the hinges and the latches a lot better. Whereas with just the base paint, it's really hard to see that. So now these latches are going from being, you know, just flat silver to actually looking like older, used metal. And it's really easy to apply. Like I said, it's the consistency of food coloring, so you just gently put it on. And here I'm using brown shade to go over the gate. So it'll make it look a little bit more realistic. The shade will go into the lines left by the 3D printer to make it look a little more like wood. And you just clean your shade brush the same way you clean the base brush. You just put it into a cup of water and shake it, and then use a piece of paper towel to take off the excess water, but make sure that you're drying your brush the way the bristles go so you don't bend them backwards. So here I'm again using the dark shade on the stone areas. So my husband had requested that this castle look a little bit old and run down, so that's why I'm making it very saturated. So you'll have to decide which color shade to use on your base coat. If I was doing, let's say, a person with a blue cape, I might use blue shade to emphasize the blueness, or maybe I'd use a different color to see how that would look. And if you make a mistake, you can, and I'll show you this in a second, you can dab it off, but you can also let it dry and just paint base paint over it again, and then do a different color shade. So you can see here, it's really giving the bricks definition. It's going into all of the cracks. So when you first apply it, it looks very dark, but then like I said, it rolls off the high parts and goes into the lower parts. So it gives the lower parts definition and lightens up the higher parts. So using the dark shade again. So you can see it's a very watery consistency. There are other things you can do with shade as well, like if you can, it can change how, it can definitely change how something looks. So if I was doing a sword, I could use this color shade to make it look, you know, almost like a very well cared for sword, or I could use like a yellow color or a rusty color to make it look old and not well cared for. So here I've put too much shade on, and I'd like to remove some of it and then redo it. So I'm just going to dab it off with some Kleenex or tissue, or paper towel works, and it's really easy to take off. It does dry very quickly though, so you have a limited time that you can take it off. So even though when you first apply it, it looks pretty watery, it does run into the cracks. So here you can see the castle has all of the shade applied that I wanted to apply to it. And like I said, you can see it's very saturated, but that was the look I was going for with this project. It's not glued together yet. I'm just getting my husband to hold it all together for this picture so you can see what it looks like. So what I'm going to show you now is how to do dry brushing. So with the brush that I have smushed and made a nice flat surface, you just take a tiny little bit of paint, like a very, very small amount, and then you spread it around on the brush, and most of it should actually be on the paper. And then what you do is you gently brush it over the parts of your model that light would hit. So any edges that are sticking out, anything that would reflect light. So a corner, like here I'm doing the corners of the steps. So you can see that I have this heavily saturated castle, which is the look I wanted because it's supposed to be old. But what I'm doing now is I'm adding white paint to the edges to give it some depth. So the idea is that if you look at something like anything at all that you have next to you and you can see where light is reflecting off it, it's a very, very light color, right? I could have like right next to me actually, I have a black computer speaker, but where light is reflecting off it, it looks like almost white, like a light gray. So that's how you can choose the color that you want to use for your dry brushing. Um, I'll show you some examples in a minute of uh, models that I've done where I've actually used color instead of it being gray like this castle. So I have color and then the colors that I've chosen for the dry brushing. But you can see here, you can see it's very subtle what it's doing, the dry brushing, but it makes a huge difference to making it look more realistic. So here I'm just adding it to these little edges. And the trick is to have very, very little paint on the brush. You want very little. If you put too much, it doesn't look like it's reflecting light anymore. Now it looks like paint. But you can see actually at this point I make a mistake and I add too much paint and I don't spread it around enough. And you can see here that it's too much. It doesn't look like it's reflecting light anymore. So what you can do is you can brush it off or try to get it off with your paper towel or tissue, and then when it's dry, just use shade again over top of it. And when that's dry, you can dry brush it again. So what I did to choose the colors for this project is I actually looked at pictures of really old castles, and that helped me decide what colors to choose. So for an example, this gate, I wanted it to look old and weathered, and I used brown for my base color and for my shade, but I used light gray for my dry brushing to make it look like old weathered wood. So here you can see a picture of the finished castle. It's all glued up now. It's perfect for rolling dice down it. And now that you've seen the process of it, you know the steps that I took, and you can recognize some of that. You can see the base paint, you can see the shade, and you can see the dry brushing. In this image, you can see where the railings are. The shade really defines parts of the railing. And then the dry brushing really defines the parts of the railing that would reflect light, the parts that are sticking out a little bit. And you can also see in the brick, like the middle part of the stairs, the dry brushing has made it look older and more scuffed. And here you can see the tops, the corners and the edges all look like they're old and have been chipped, but that's all from the dry brushing. Here are a few other models that I've painted. If you look carefully at the red dragon guy, above his eyes are these little bones that stick out, and I wanted those to be a little more apparent. So what I did, since he has this dark red color, is I actually chose a light, almost fluorescent pink color for the dry brushing, and that made it look a lot more obvious. And if you look at his axe, you can see the little white bones that stick out from the green. Those I dry brushed in white because they're supposed to be bones. So these are all things that you can do to emphasize parts of your project. Again, if you look at the red dragon person, on his stomach, you can absolutely see his muscle definition, and that's from the shade. In the middle picture, there's a sheep and it has a white nose and it's wool, but what I did is I painted it black, and then the dry brushing I did to do the wool, I did in two different colors. The lower one I did gray, and then on top of that I did white. And I also did that on the nose and above the eyes. So that really gives it definition. And on the third picture, with the woman and the guitar and the knife, I used dry brushing on the top of the shirt. It's like a light, almost yellow color. So these are all like really subtle ways to give your project a little more depth. Okay, so let's talk about finishing touches a little bit. You can see on the tree dice tower that I painted, I also added some moss to it to give it a little more realistic look, and you can do that by just gluing it on. And also on the dragon, I put some glue on the base, and then I attached these little pebbles and little stickers of grass. And these things that I got those from a gaming store, but you don't have to. You could just use a paintbrush to paint glue onto the base, and you could, dip it in some sand. That would look really great, or you could add your own stuff. But there are finishing touches that you can do to make it a little more realistic. All right, we're coming to the end of the video, but I wanted to show you how awesome it is to watch this dice tower that you've seen painted from start to finish in action in slow-mo. If you have further questions, you can contact the Maker Studio at makerstudio@mtroyal.ca, or you can email the Maker Studio staff.